Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us for June's Leaders Initiative seminar. My name is Stephanie, and I will be monitoring things here on the back end. Just take note, our next Leaders Initiative conference will be July 21st. Dr. Emily Pennerbarsi will be presenting when TDP 43 shows up late. Towards the end of this conference, I will be sending out a Qualtrics evaluation, so please take your time to fill that out, and we love to hear other topics that you are interested in learning about and keep this series going. And with that, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Patty Monaghan. Dr. Monaghan is a postdoctoral research fellow in the Neuroimaging and Neurorehabilitation Laboratory within the Department of Healthcare Sciences and Department of Neurology at Wayne State University. His research is centered on unraveling the intricate neural mechanisms governing movement and postural controls in older adults and individuals with neurologic disorders. His research aims to understand why people have difficulty moving and balancing, and to develop neurorehabilitation techniques that enhance and optimize functional mobility and quality of life. And with that, I will turn things over to you, Patty.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Let me go ahead and share my screen real quick. Okay, wonderful. Let me just move this to the side. Okay, wonderful. So hi, everyone. Yes, thank you for the wonderful introduction. My name is Patty Monaghan. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow in the Neuroimaging and Rehabilitation Lab and the Institute of Gerontology here at Wayne State University. And I'm really excited to be here this morning and discuss some of my ongoing work. So my plan of attack for today is to first describe a little bit about my background, including some of my personal and sort of academic background. And I think this is important too, because it's important, but often overlooked about how, despite being a very early career investigator, how each of my distinct experiences so far have really shaped my program of research and are foundational to my sort of long-term research goals. I'll then describe what my program of research is and what my ultimate long-term research goals strive to do. Then provide some examples of some previous and ongoing work, and then finish up with the future next steps, or what is the future of my program of research and what's coming down the pipeline. So first of all, a little bit of my background. So I was born and raised in a small little village in the northeast coast of Ireland, called Rathfarnham in County Down. Depicted by the little red star on the map over here. It's halfway between Belfast and Dublin, right beneath the Mourne Mountains. So if you ever get an opportunity to visit, it's a really lovely part of the world. I implore that you do so. And then when I was 17, I packed up my bags and I left my little village, and I left for the lights and for the glitz and the ritz of Starkville, Mississippi, where I took up an athletic scholarship and I competed as a distance runner in the Southeastern Conference, specializing in the mile and the half mile. And while there, I completed my undergraduate degree in clinical exercise physiology. In 2017, I headed to the Front Range of the Rockies to the beautiful Fort Collins, Colorado, where I got my master's degree in health and exercise science at Colorado State University. And it was during this time that I first got exposed to and took my first steps into the research world. So working alongside Dr. Brett Fling in the sensory motor neuroimaging lab, I got my feet wet in training with neuroimaging, neuromodulatory approaches, and general motor control principles, particularly working with individuals with multiple sclerosis. Then in 2019, I just loved the South so much, I headed back down south to the loveliest little village in the plains, where I got my PhD at Auburn University, working with Dr. Jamie Roper in the locomotor and movement control lab. And here my research kind of focus shifted a little bit. Having gained, an initial appreciation for the neural control of movement, my research focus here shifted to understanding how these motor impairments, walking and balance difficulties that may arise as a result of these neural alterations, how are they clinically manifested within research, within a laboratory, or even within a clinical setting? So shifted a little bit more towards biomechanics during my PhD. Then in 2023, I headed straight north to where I currently am at Wayne State University, working with Dr. Nora Fritz in the Neuroimaging and Rehabilitation Lab. And in here, my main focus was kind of taking this next step in my training, where I really wanted to enhance my understanding or my ability to disentangle this sort of complex interaction and interplay between motor and cognitive decline, either as it results from some form of neuropathology or even just throughout our typical aging process. So that's where I've been ever since, and I've been really enjoying the work that I've been doing here, both through the Institute of Gerontology and in the Neuroimaging and Rehabilitation Lab. And again, I'll hear some more about some of my ongoing work in the upcoming slides. So now that you know all about the contents of my passport and my travel history, I want to try to make it clear how each of these experiences have really shaped my program of research. And in order to do so, I kind of start with this sort of basic question, okay? So what is performance? So on this next slide, if you don't mind, if you have your phone handy, I'd like you to scan the QR code at the top left-hand corner of this slide and just help me populate this word cloud. So your responses will automatically pop up on this screen here. And I want to know is just what does the word performance mean to you? When you hear the word performance, what words, actions, thoughts, or what connotations come to your mind when you think of the word performance? And I know that we've got a nice sort of maybe interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary audience, so kind of really excited to see what sort of replies we get. Okay, awesome. Capability space. I'll just leave it up here for another 30 seconds or so. And then I promise you on the next couple of slides, I'm going to explain again why this question is so important or why it's really shaped my program of research. Capabilities, effort, power, speed, function, athletes, balance, completing a task. Okay, awesome. This is great. This is also really a good brainstorming activity for me as well. Okay, so again, why I asked this question was because my research journey began with this sort of subtle yet profound shift in how I understood this very concept of performance. So growing up in Ireland as this fairly competitive distance runner, my sole ambition, drive, and motivation for even moving stateside was to one day represent Ireland in the Olympic Games. So to me, performance was always about, excelling at this high level, at this high elite level, how fast I could run, how far I could run, how many people I could beat. I also have an identical twin brother, so usually it was always about beating him as well. But this was always my view, how I viewed performance. But my perspective soon changed when I first entered a gain and balance research lab, particularly during my time at Colorado State University when we were working with individuals with multiple sclerosis. And observing how, these subtle walking and balance difficulties can transform these seemingly mundane everyday activities, that we often take for granted into Mount Everest, right? Into these monumental challenges that exude this incredible difficulty, really led me to change that the performance is so much more than just this high level elite athletic metric. So it really led me to think about and redefine in the context of my program of research, how I see performance. And I often see performance as this fundamental ability to move and to navigate our everyday environments, to overcome demands placed upon us by our external surroundings, so that we can promote functional independence and overall quality of life. So again, it's just this whole recapitulation or this realization of what performance meant to me. And again, it's important to note that this realization and this redefinition, is central to my program of research and is foundational to my ultimate long-term research goals. And so this slide just provides a nice sort of conceptual framework or scaffolding that describes and encapsulates my overall program of research. So as a result of aging or as a result of some form of pathology or neuropathology, that we can see alterations within the nervous system. And again, depending upon what area of that nervous system is impacted, we can see a compromised wide variety of functions. So we can see motor dysfunctions such as those walking and balance difficulties. We can typically see multi-domain cognitive impairments. We can see spasticity, rigidity. We can see adverse psychological outcomes. Again, all dependent upon what area of the nervous system is impacted. And unfortunately, these compromised functions can have severe consequences. Often it can place individuals at increased risk for falls, kind of decreased physical activity, increased social isolation, increased threat of institutionalization. And when we think of it similar or concomitantly as a whole, it can reduce performance. It can reduce one's ability to navigate their everyday surroundings, limit functional mobility, and overall compromise one's quality of life. And as I mentioned in my background slides, in my current work in my postdoc is really focused on examining this complex interplay and interaction between motor and cognitive decline, again, either as a result of neuropathology or as a result of the aging process. So my research seeks to examine these neural and cognitive mechanisms that underlie these mobility impairments. And in order to do so, I partner with vulnerable populations across the spectrum, across the disease continuum, that experience pathologies that differentially impact the separate neural, cognitive, and motor domains. So working with healthy older adults, individuals with multiple sclerosis and Alzheimer's disease and related dementias, as well as working with individuals in the preclinical stage of cognitive decline. So this is my research roadmap, which helps keep me aligned whenever I go off track, which happens to be quite frequently. But I think it also really depicts the sort of uniqueness of my research approach. So as I mentioned before, my ultimate long-term research goal is to enhance performance. I want to leverage our enhanced understanding of these neural and cognitive underpinnings of mobility impairments so we can make those activities of daily living a little bit less like those Mount Everests, make them a little bit less challenging to promote that functional independence and overall quality of life. So any of the research questions, any of the Ames hypotheses that I write or I study, again, this is the final destination that is always in mind. And in order to get there, again, I employ several different key methods, which I sort of refer to as my on-ramps, which are going to, again, help us get to my ultimate long-term research goal, or at least help us enter ourselves along this road. So for example, I work with a variety of different populations across the disease continuum, including healthy older adults, individuals with preclinical cognitive decline, such as mild cognitive impairment, as well as individuals in the clinical states of MS and Alzheimer's disease and related dementias. And by studying these individual populations and by comparing them, it gives me the greatest opportunity to understand this interaction between motor and cognitive functioning at different stages of both the aging and the disease process. Secondly, I use a variety of different tools to help us get to our final destination. And again, I do want to highlight and caution that, again, many of these tools in my current early career are still under refinement. But by implementing these wide variety of tools, such as mobility and cognitive assessments, MRI imaging, blood-based biomarkers, accelerometry, and these machine learning approaches, by including various different aspects of these tools, it allows me to study this complex interaction and interplay in the most detailed, holistic, and multidimensional way. And finally, I've got my multi-domain background training, again, which you may have picked up on through my early background slides. Having received training in biomechanics, motor control, motor learning, and neural control of movement, as well as the clinical exercise physiology. So again, by tackling this problem or this research statement from multiple different angles, it just provides me the most holistic way to enhance my understanding of these neural and cognitive underpinnings of mobility impairment. So again, as I said, I study, again, a wide variety of populations at different stages of the disease continuum. So over the next section of slides, I'm going to provide some examples of some of the previous and ongoing work that I've done in these select few different populations. And we're first going to begin with some of my dissertation work from my PhD at Auburn University, where we studied gait adaptation in healthy older adults. So the purpose of this set of studies were to examine age-related differences in this gait adaptation and gait adaptation strategies. So the world that we live in, our everyday surroundings, they're incredibly complex. It's probably the understatement of the century, but the daily environments that we are continually exposed to are incredibly dynamic and they're incredibly ever-changing. Therefore, it would sort of make sense that we have this innate we have to have some form of flexibility in order to overcome the challenges placed upon us by these dynamic and ever-changing environments. And that's precisely what gait adaptation is. So gait adaptation refers to the ability to adjust our gait patterns in order to overcome task demands. Again, so this is going to have huge implications for performance, right? So we can overcome demands placed upon us by the environment so that we can navigate our everyday surroundings, promote functional independence, and ultimate quality of life. Now, there are many common daily scenarios where we have to exude this gait flexibility, probably without even realizing it. So think about walking on different types of terrain, right? You're walking on a nice smooth concrete pavement versus a rocky trail. Or, you go from walking on the beach on sand onto like a wooden boardwalk or something like that. Or even other scenarios such as wearing different types of shoes, right? Different types of footwear if you're in heels versus flats. Think about what it took you to get into work today and to sit down into the computer and hear me talk for this hour or so, right? You had to overcome many different obstacles, avoid obstacles, step up and down curbs. Thankfully, at least here, it's not raining, so you didn't have to avoid any puddles. But each of these scenarios provide concrete examples of when we have to adjust aspects of our gait. We have to adjust aspects of where and when we place our feet down in order to perform optimally in our external surroundings. And again, this may be taken for granted for the likes of you and I, but for individuals with neurologic disorders or older adults, again, this can be incredibly challenging. And I know you may be thinking, looking at these two sets of images here, that these are extreme examples and no one's daily environments may look like this. But perhaps they look more like this. Consider an older adult in a grocery store maneuvering a tight aisle while pushing a shopping cart, having to avoid other shoppers, other carts, while also trying to remember, what aisle the meal is on or what is on their shopping list. Or again, think about crossing a busy crosswalk within some sort of city, where again, you're going to be avoiding people walking in the opposite direction with their bags, maybe there's bikes, and you've got a set amount of time you have in order to complete this feat, or again, the consequences can be dire. So these are just some everyday examples of when having the ability to adjust your gait is incredibly crucial. So again, this gait adaptation just refers to the ability to adjust our walking patterns to meet task demands so that we can perform optimally within our surroundings. And we're able to use a special type of treadmill called the split belt treadmill, which is pictured here on the right, which is like a regular treadmill, except for it's got two independent belts that can be controlled independently. Now, we're able to use this tool to measure how well individuals are able to adapt their gait and exhibit or exert this gait flexibility. Specifically, we can drive one leg twice or even 3 times faster than the other, introduce this novel perturbation, this non-automatic complex movement strategies, and see how well individuals can acquire a new gait pattern. Not only that, we're also able to delve a little bit deeper and see what strategies individuals may employ in order to adapt their walking patterns. So again, this is just a video of what it may look like. So again, here we have an individual. You can see their right leg is going to be going 3 times faster than their left leg, which is going to be in a slow belt. So this just provides an example of creating this sort of perturbation, this non-automatic complex movement strategy, which our central nervous system is not used to. Many of us are not used to walking with one leg going 3 times faster than the other. So this gives us a great opportunity to examine how individuals can respond and learn a new walking pattern. So to any split belt treadmill paradigm, there are several different phases, okay? And I'm just going to have a simplified explanation of each of them. First of all, on our y-axis here, we can see what is referred to asymmetry or step length asymmetry. And it just refers to the differences in step lengths. So the differences between the leg on the fast belt versus the leg on the slow belt. And it is a commonly used and well-established metric of gait flexibility. So it gives us an index of how well individuals can adapt their gait. So to any paradigm, we've got 3 distinct phases, at least 3. Again, there are some more, but this is going to just demonstrate the 3 key stages. The first one is going to be our baseline phase. So as you can see in the video here, and as you can see by this yellow line, this is like typical treadmill walking. The belts are moving at the same speed, so it's just like you're walking with your typical walking pattern. And such, you can see that this yellow line right here is going to be right around 0. So the asymmetry is 0, because again, it's just like our typical walking pattern. The next phase, or the fun phase, is going to be whenever the belts are going to be driven at those different speeds, like you saw in that last video. So one of the legs will be moving twice or even 3 times faster than the other for a prolonged period of time. And as you can see depicted by this blue line, initially those asymmetries are going to be quite pronounced. And then over the course of this 10 or 15-minute period, the asymmetries are gradually reduced and they come back towards 0 as our nervous system recalibrates this motor program. And then the final phase, again, is personally my favorite, and I think the most fascinating phase is the de-adaptation phase. So during this phase of split belt treadmill walking, the belts are returned to move at that same speed, so similar to baseline. But as we can see depicted by the red curve here, we still see these asymmetries that are present. And you might be wondering, well, if the belts are going the same speed, why do we see these asymmetries and why are they going in the opposite direction? So these are what we refer to as negative after effects. And these are part and parcel of a normal, healthy, functioning nervous system. What these negative after effects show is that those adjustments that your central nervous system made to recalibrate that motor program during that prolonged period of split belt treadmill walking, they were stored and temporarily retained by the nervous system. Hence, we see this overcompensation and this asymmetry in the opposite direction, which again, after a couple of minutes of walking normally, become washed out. Okay, so now that we have a general gist of how we can incorporate this within a study design, what did we find? Well, we found that older adults can retain the capacity to adapt a novel walking pattern and are capable of exhibiting this gait flexibility. So on this top graph here, this shows you step-by-step asymmetry values during 10 minutes of split belt treadmill walking, so that adaptation phase where one leg is going twice as fast as the other, in our older adults in orange and in our younger adults in blue. And again, these shaded boxes in the background just represent different periods of that adaptation period. So we took some steps from the early portion, from the mid portion, and then during the latter portion of that adaptation phase. And as you can see by the similarities in these curves, as well as in the individualized scatter plots depicted below, that older adults were able to retain the capacity not differently from the younger adults. So this was great. We're like, oh, great. Older adults compared to younger adults, there's no differences in their ability to exert this gait flexibility and to adapt their walking patterns to this novel perturbation. But as I mentioned at the start of this section of slides, when we are having to adjust our gait, in these everyday environments, this is our formula for our step length asymmetry, our overall outcome metric of gait flexibility. But when we're adapting our gait, we can adjust aspects of both where and when we place our foot. So there are distinct spatial and temporal components to this step length asymmetry outcome. It is more like this hybrid component. So our next question then became, well, okay, we know that older adults can retain or can adapt their gait pattern, but do they do so differently compared to younger adults? And so that's what we sought to measure here. So on the left-hand side here, we have our spatial strategy, and on the right-hand side, we have our temporal strategy. Again, our y-axis just represents those 3 different time points of adaptation, and our y-axis is that gait flexibility outcome, okay, how well we can adjust our gait. So first of all, when we looked at our spatial strategy, we found that there were no significant differences between older and younger adults. So there was no age-related differences in their ability to enact these spatial strategies to adapt their walking patterns. However, when we looked at the temporal strategies, we found that there were significant differences. In fact, we find that regardless of the time point of adaptation, older adults continuously use less temporal strategies compared to the younger adult counterparts, which we thought was very interesting. So we find that, again, older adults can adapt a novel walking pattern, but perhaps they use different strategies in order to do so in order to exhibit such flexibility. Namely, they may be using less time and have to rely on more of this spatial strategy compared to the younger adults. And again, when we think about the potential implications of this, I think there are distinct both mechanistic and clinical implications. Through a more clinical lens, if we're thinking about a rehabilitation program where we're trying to instruct and trying to teach a novel motor program, perhaps delivering more spatially oriented cues might provide the most successful route for adapting this new motor program. Through a mechanistic lens, we know that there's distinct neural circuitry responsory for governing spatial versus temporal control. And we know that prior research has already shown that temporal deficits or temporal control may be more susceptible to age-related decline, again, which may corroborate the results of our study. But one thing that I've thought of throughout my early career so far is that whenever you go into a study with one question, you come out with like a million more. So some of the thoughts that we had after these initial studies were, well, how would these findings translate to more clinical populations? Would we still see these temporal deficits be present? Would they be more pronounced? Would they even be there at all? We also thought that, again, these split belt treadmill paradigms are incredibly insightful and useful. But again, how translatable and scalable and feasible are they to clinical and real world settings, right? And to that angle, are there other sort of these non-automatic complex movement strategies that may relate to real world function and may be able to have some form of predictive validity in predicting real world performance that might be a little bit more feasible and clinical friendly instead of having needing a split belt treadmill? So these questions naturally extend into some of my ongoing work that I've been doing in my postdoc over the last couple of years here at Wayne State University, particularly working in individuals with multiple sclerosis. So as I highlighted in my conceptual framework slides, for older adults and individuals with neurologic disorders such as MS, falls are an unfortunate commonality. In fact, in individuals with MS, in any given 6-month period, greater than 70% of individuals with MS will experience a fall. And the consequences of these falls can be, again, severe and dire. So it's been estimated that, again, they can require large medical costs. So the cost of an average hospital stay resulting from an injurious fall is estimated to be greater than $30,000, which can lead to an incredible financial burden, both at the patient level, but also at the federal level. We can also see again this decreased performance resulting from falls. We can see poorer mental health and psychological outcomes. We may see, physical injury, of course. We may see decreased physical activity, social isolation, and the threat of institutionalization. And again, to go back to again my overall definition of performance, it can reduce one's functional independence, reduce their ability to navigate their everyday surroundings, and ultimately compromise the overall quality of life. So therefore, it may seem quite apparent and evident that there is a need to establish these sensitive mobility assessments that are capable of detecting real-world things like falls before they actually occur. And that's what some of my recent work has been really attempting to do. And in particular, our lab, we've really tried to show that backwards may be the way forward for the individuals with multiple sclerosis, and that backwards walking may fill this void as being this sensitive clinical assessment. So just like the split bill treadmill walking, which was a little bit less common, of a motor task, backwards walking presents a similar complex non-automatic movement strategy. Now, I want to first delineate between what is backward stepping versus sustained backwards walking. Backward stepping we do in many daily scenarios. So, think about backing up from opening a door or a fridge or maneuvering in a tight space. But sustained continuous backward walking, on the other hand, might be a little bit less common. And so it represents this similar non-automatic motor skill. And compared to forward walking, research has shown that backwards walking places it has increased cognitive demands, particularly for domains such as attention and information processing speed, as well as visuospatial memory. We've also shown that it's more challenging for our postural control system and requires a degree of sensory reweighting. When we're walking backwards, we no longer have vision of our line of path of progression, so we have to be able to shift our sensory reliance to perhaps focus more on these proprioceptive and somatosensory cues. Compared to forward walking, backwards walking has also been shown to have increased cardiovascular demands, as well as also being more challenging for our lower extremity strength system. So all in all, we think again that backwards walking again might fill this void. So last year, we had a study published in the International Journal of Multiple Sclerosis Care, where we tried to derive the measurement properties, the sensitivity, the reliability, and the validity of this backwards walking clinical assessment tool. And I think this is important too before we widely employ it within a clinical setting and to maximize its potential interpretive capacity across the literature, that we're fully able to understand the measurement properties that are associated with this complex movement strategy. So what we did to do this, we had 23 individuals with multiple sclerosis come into the lab for 2 visits separated by 1 week. During the visit, they completed the timed 25-foot walk in the backward direction. We then retest reliability was assessed through computing the interclass correlation coefficients that can be observed within the table here. Additionally, we also showed the responsiveness of the intervention of this assessment tool by calculating the minimal detectable change values for these backward walking outcomes. Innovatively as well, we did look at velocity, but we also looked at a wide facet or a wide array of spatiotemporal parameters of backwards walking gait. And what we find was that all of the spatiotemporal parameters of gait exhibited good to excellent retest reliability, as can be observed within the in the table. And it's also displayed within these scatter plots. So at the top, we have backwards walking at our comfortable speed, and on the bottom, we've got backwards walking at our fastest but safest walking speed. The x-axis represents the visit 1 velocity, and the y-axis represent the velocity at visit 2. So the closer those data points hug that red line of unity, that suggests and indicates a higher degree of retest reliability. So again, we thought that these were promising and encouraging outcomes, showing that again, backwards walking is this sensitive and responsive clinical tool. But we also wanted to do next was to assess whether or not this backwards walking tool has any predictive validity of real-world function in individuals with multiple sclerosis. So what we did after the same 23 individuals with MS, after their second visit, we equipped them with a Fitbit Versa 2 device, in which we could track their volume and intensity of their physical activity over the next 6 months. They also received weekly fall surveys each week for the next 6 months so that we could track for any future fall occurrence. And what we found that it was modestly correlated with prospective falls, the backwards walking velocity, but again, important to consider that we had somewhat of a limited sample size within this analysis. But interestingly, what we did find was that backwards walking performance was strongly correlated with future physical activity levels in these individuals with multiple sclerosis. Particularly, we found that individuals that had a faster backwards walking velocity were associated with engaging in those more intense or those more vigorous type of activity minutes, both at 3 months and 6 months post-visit. And again, we think this is incredibly promising and encouraging because it shows us that, again, backwards walking might have this predictability. It might have this be accurate in predicting things like physical activity, which is wonderful when individuals come in and they perform better in the lab, but being able to have a clinical tool that can track function perhaps where it matters most, when individuals are out engaging in their environments, in their daily surroundings, is incredibly important. So again, based upon these findings, again, the next thing we did was explore this relatively novel and insightful metric called the backwards walking speed reserve in individuals with MS. So this backwards walking speed reserve outcome is essentially a measure of speed modulation capacity. Can individuals increase their walking speed on demand, which may hold real-world implications, right? And can be significantly relevant to many daily life scenarios, right? To go back to, for example, crossing that crosswalk, where you've got set amount of time in which you need to achieve a motor feat. So what we did, in order to calculate this backwards walking speed reserve, individuals come into the lab, they completed the time 25-foot walk in the backwards direction at their comfortable walking speed. They then also computed this time 25-foot walk at their fastest but safest walking speed. And then we were able to calculate this reserve, this measure of speed modulation, as the difference between their fastest and their comfortable walking speed. And if you want to scan the QR code there was a little article feature in this article done last year. But again, our hope was that, similar to this previous studies where we looked at backwards walking velocity, that these novel and insightful metrics, again, might hold significant real-world implications. And so what we found that the backwards walking speed reserve showed strong concurrent validity to other commonly used, well-established clinical assessments of mobility in not just individuals with MS, but in a range of neurologic populations as well as older adults. So for example, here on the x-axis, we have our backwards walking speed reserve outcome. So here, higher values are going to represent greater speed modulation capacity. So the individuals were able to were more readily able to increase their speed on demand. And on our y-axis here, we've got our timed up and go performance, with lower values representing faster time to completion and thus in better physical function. And what we find was that better speed modulation capacity was associated with better physical function and functional mobility. And again, as we highlighted in the background slide regarding backwards walking, we find that again it tracked with cognitive functioning, that it is a more cognitively demanding task. So again, our x-axis here are going to be the backwards walking speed reserve. In our left, we're going to have our SDMT as our measure of information processing speed. And in our right, we're going to have the trails making test part A as our measure of attentional performance. And as we can see here, increased speed modulation capacity was associated with better information processing speed and attentional performance in individuals with MS. So again, really encouraging. So far we've shown again that backwards walking may be the way forward, that is a valid and reliable assessment tool of functional mobility, that it may hold some promise in being a sensitive predictor of future physical activity and real-world function in individuals with MS. And again, these novel and insightful metrics, such as these speed modulation outcomes, may provide novel insights and have real-world implications. But again, we had a lot more questions after conducting these series of studies. So we know backwards walking, again, might be a sensitive clinical assessment tool, but how would it serve as an intervention? Can backwards walking serve as an effective intervention for individuals with mobility disabilities? And again, stay tuned on this. We should have some interesting results coming really soon on this front. But owing to the fact that we've seen backwards walking being not only strongly associated and correlated with typical functional mobility assessments, but that it also tends to be more cognitively demanding and tracking with cognitive functioning, is it possible that this non-automatic complex motor strategy may be a sensitive biomarker for detecting individuals at early mobility or cognitive decline? And then what makes backwards walking unique? So what perhaps makes it a little bit more of a sensitive predictor of things like falls and physical activity compared to forward walking? Are there distinct neural correlates or neural mechanisms that might underlie this non-automatic complex movement strategy? And that is precisely what we did in our next study, where we wanted to try to explore and examine what are the neurologic mechanisms that might be underlying backwards walking performance. Now, while the underlying mechanisms of backwards walking remain largely unknown in humans, there's been much research done in higher and lower vertebrates showing that there's distinct muscle activity pattern activation during backward locomotion versus forward locomotion. And in some preclinical studies, including in models of Drosophila, salamander, rodents, and cats, there's been some evidence showing that, again, that there's distinct neural pathways governing backward versus forward walking. And I think my personal favorite is the descending moonwalking neurons that were found and reported in this model of Drosophila. And again, from humans, we've shown some evidence from split bell treadmill studies that, again, there might be distinct functional networks responsible for forward versus backwards walking. But again, limited work has been paired with neuroimaging or been done in a population of multiple sclerosis. So again, this is the gap that we sought to fill with our next study. So again, to explore this, we had 23 individuals with relapse-remitting MS come into our lab. And they underwent an MRI scan in which we did myelin water imaging. So myelin water imaging is this this gold standard surrogate measure of myelin integrity and myelin content. And from the myelin water imaging, we extracted what is known as the myelin water fraction, which measures the proportion of water that is trapped within those myelin layers. So an easy and fun way to remember this is that the more myelin wraps is the more water trapped. So increased MWF values are going to be indicative of enhanced myelin integrity or increased myelin content. So we measured the myelin water fraction in 4 distinct regions of interest that are white motor tracts heavily implicated in motor function, including the body of the corpus callosum, the superior cerebellar peduncle, and then the corticospinal tract, as well as the inferior cerebellar peduncle. Participants then completed a series of clinical mobility assessments, including the timed 25-foot walk in both the forward and the backwards walking direction. Okay, and so what we found was we reported that, again, there may be distinct neural correlates associated with backwards and forward walking performance in individuals with multiple sclerosis. So in our first regression model, which is depicted here at the top, which is concerning forward walking velocity, we found that above and independent upon the effects of age and PDDS, we found that it was the myelin water fraction of the body of the corpus callosum that was a significant predictor of forward walking velocity. So greater myelin content or greater myelin integrity of the corpus callosum body was associated with faster forward walking velocity. And again, this is perhaps not too surprising when we consider the bilateral coordination requirements of typical gait. However, when we looked at backwards walking in our next regression model, again, independent of the effects of age and PDDS, we found it was the myelin water fraction of the superior cerebellar peduncle that best predicted backwards walking performance. That was greater myelin integrity or myelin content of the superior cerebellar peduncle was associated with faster backwards walking performance. So again, here we can start to see that, again, there may be these distinct neural correlates of both governing forward versus backwards walking performance in individuals with MS. So again, over these last couple of slides, we've shown, again, that backwards walking is this non-automatic complex movement that is related to multi-domain cognitive functioning. We've shown that there might be distinct neural correlates for backward walking compared to forward walking, with the corpus callosum being a significant predictor of forward walking performance and the superior cerebellar peduncle best predicting backwards walking performance. So again, going from here, we thought about, again, some of these key regions that we've implicated within these studies are not solely and independently responsible for governing motor function. There's a lot of shared neural architecture that is also responsible for efficient and effective cognitive functioning, not just motor functioning. So again, knowing this, and again, knowing that, again, the tracks with cognitive decline, with cognitive functioning, it's possible these backwards walking may serve as a sensitive biomarker for detecting early mobility or even cognitive decline. And could it help to predict those at risk for decline in preclinical stages of diseases such as Alzheimer's disease and related dementia? So again, this leads into some of my ongoing work that I'm currently doing as part of the MEDRC as a REC mentee, in which we're going to be exploring this very question. We're going to assess whether complex mobility measures, such as backwards walking, can identify persons at risk for preclinical cognitive decline in a diverse community-based sample. So research has shown that we know typical age-related neurodegeneration can lead to motor and cognitive declines, ultimately increasing one's risk for developing Alzheimer's disease and related dementias. But research has also shown us that in individuals that are high risk for developing AD-RD, motor deficits and these mobility impairments often begin in midlife, preceding the onset of clinical cognitive decline by upwards of a decade. And since we know that subtle motor deficits are associated with multi-domain cognitive functioning, and we know that these motor deficits are related to the rate of cognitive decline in a dose-dependent manner, it's plausible that complex movement strategies such as backwards walking may be sensitive risk biomarkers capable of detecting individuals at risk for cognitive decline in the preclinical stages of the disease. And again, I want to highlight too that that's important too, right? Especially if we're able to do it in the preclinical stage of the disease, this is going to give us the best possible opportunity to intervene or perhaps identify individuals that might be at higher risk for factor progression, or again, that we can hopefully slow down or eradicate ADRD risk altogether. So again, this is the first aim of my ongoing project with as a rec mentee is going to examine the relationship between self-reported measures of mobility and cognitive function over time. And then my second aim is going to examine the relationship between these self-reported measures of mobility and blood-based biomarkers of neurodegeneration heavily implicated in ADRD risk. Okay, I think at this point it's important to highlight as well that again, those first two aims I mentioned are including self-reported measures of mobility, again, which are incredibly important, incredibly useful, and incredibly feasible, especially when dealing with community-based settings. But I think it's important to note at this stage that self-reported measures of mobility or function do not always align with objective clinical assessments. We know that self-reported measures of mobility require an individual's their own subjective awareness of their motor capacity, and again, may not always track with physical function or with physiological outcomes. And to help display this, we've got some ongoing work in our lab, which is displaying this very topic of discordance, or this mismatch or this misalignment between perceived versus physical function. And this can be depicted in this little just quadrant graph that I have depicted on the right-hand side of the slide here. So on our x-axis, we've got our physiological measure as walk speed. So this is when you come into the lab and we would measure your physiological fall risk, for example, by having you do the time 25-foot walk. Any values to the right are going to be a faster walking speed, so that's going to be less fall risk. Anything to the left is going to be again slower walking speed again, so you might be at an increased physiological fall risk. And on our y-axis, we've got self-reported fall risk, which could be done through questionnaires such as the Fall FC Scale International. And here we have higher scores are going to represent less of a cycle or perceived risk, and then lesser values representing, again, going to be at that higher perceived risk. And so what you can see here is that we can develop this sort of quadrant-based system. So again, these two are going to be what we call concordant quadrants. So these are going to be when an individual's perceived risks actually lines up with their physiological risk. So individuals may report having greater self-reported walking difficulty, and we would bring them into the lab during the walking assessments, they tend to walk a little bit slower. Conversely, on the opposite quadrant, we're going to have the individuals concordantly have lower self-reported walking difficulty, and then again, when they come in the lab, they walk faster. But interestingly, what we can see is we can have these two discordant profiles, or we can have what we refer to as this mismatch or this misalignment, where again, on the bottom left, we may have these individuals who have lower self-reported walking difficulty, and then they walk slower. And what we've shown in our sample of individuals with MS and our ongoing work is that 1 in 4 individuals with multiple sclerosis will experience this discordance or this mismatch. And we've also shown that this discordance can also influence real-world behavior, including things like functional mobility and future physical activity levels. So again, that just provides a little bit of an example of why self-reported measures, again, are important, but it's important to take this holistic, well-rounded approach to study this complex problem. So in the third aim of my REC project, I'm going to be evaluating the relationship between clinical objective mobility assessments, including backwards walking and multi-domain physical function assessments, in a sample of at-risk individuals for Alzheimer's disease and related dementias. Okay, so for the last couple of minutes here, I'm just going to finish up with describing what is next down the pipeline, and what are the future next steps for my program of research. So over the past 30 minutes or so, you all have been incredibly patient and heard me talk about research in various range of populations, again, at different stages of the disease continuum. So we discussed split belt treadmill walking and gait adaptation strategies in healthy older adults. We discussed the inclusion of complex motor assessments such as backwards walking as perhaps being the sensitive risk biomarkers capable of detecting individuals at risk in the preclinical stage of disease. And then we've also discussed things like how backwards walking, again, might be a sensitive fall risk predictor in individuals with multiple sclerosis. But the future of my research program is to consider these neurologic disorders or neurodegenerative diseases within the context of aging. So we know by the year 2034 that the number of older adults age 65 or older is going to outnumber those younger adults age 18 or younger for the first time in US history. It's also kind of alarming that I think I've used that one several times, and 2034 is coming scarily close. But an unfortunate comment with this increase in prevalence, we're going to see older adults living with these chronic neurodegenerative diseases. So we're going to see an increased prevalence in older adults living with these conditions. Now, an unfortunate shared characteristics between older adults and individuals with neurologic disorders is the increased prevalence of functional deficits, such as motor and cognitive impairments. But what about the older adults that are living with these neurologic disorders? They may face this combined burden and this dual threat of not only dealing with typical age-related trajectories and function, but also living with a chronic neurodegenerative disease. So again, I've got another little bit of a question here. So again, if you just would be kind enough to scan the QR code in the top left-hand corner and just answer these questions. So if two people are both at the same chronological age, both age 65 years old, do you think they'll have the same physical and cognitive profile? Yes or no? So two individuals reporting of the same age, do we think that they'll have the same sort of motor and sort of cognitive functioning? I'll just leave it up here for a little bit. Okay, no, living the nose. Okay, we have one yes. Okay, hopefully I can convince the yes otherwise in a little bit. Okay, so my next question is then going to be, do you think that looking at chronological age alone, so that number that's in your birth certificate, that's in your passport, do you think it provides enough insight to track changes in motor and cognitive function? You think, yep, it's a good tool, absolutely, it covers everything. It's useful, but it might not paint the entire picture, or no, not at all. Okay, I'll just leave this up here thank you for your feedback. I love the interactive nature. I was really scared that I didn't think anyone was going to do it, so this is comforting. Okay, awesome. So yes, absolutely. I would be aligned with the 63% of the individuals that responded it's useful, but might not paint the entire picture. My reason for this is we know that there's been a lot of evidence right now showing that biological age can be separated from chronological age. So we know chronological age to be, I refer to it as an index of the passage of human time, right? It's time since birth, that number that appears in our passport, on our birth certificate. Biological age, on the other hand, is more concerned with these underlying processes at the biological level. More specifically, it is concerned with these accumulation of these disease-independent pathophysiological changes that contribute to mortality or morbidity and mortality over the course of time. And again, while chronological age is useful, like we just highlighted, I don't think it paints the entire picture. For example, it doesn't theorize that two individuals of the same chronological age can experience the aging process at different rates. It also doesn't fully explain why we see such distinct heterogeneity and variability in age-related outcomes of two individuals at the same age. And again, so that's why I think we need to go beyond just looking at chronological age and including these measures of more biological age, especially when there's been recent literature such as this study that was produced by Tan and colleagues in Nature last year, where they've showed evidence of accelerated aging, both in individuals with multiple sclerosis and Alzheimer's disease and related dementias. So within this, they recruited 16 individuals from 16 different chronic disease states. And within each of these 16 chronic disease states, they computed an algorithm and computed what was their biological age for each of these chronic states. And as you can see on this clock right here, so anything that right is around 0 is mean there's your biological and your chronological age are in alignment. Anything to the left would be a younger biological age, and then anything to the right is going to be an older biological age, or you're going to have a bigger biological age gap. And so what you can see here is that to the right, the two disease states that were furthest to the right were individuals with dementia and individuals with MS. So again, providing encouraging evidence of this accelerated aging in MS and ADRD. And so while particularly in individuals with multiple sclerosis or neurologic conditions, associations have been made between mobility and cognitive impairments, but the majority of the literature has made these associations looking at chronological age alone. And we just showed evidence highlighting that there's accelerated aging within these populations. So again, there's more and more updated literature coming out now considering biological age, but I think it's important that we're able to go beyond looking at chronological age alone. And again, that's what I hope the future of my research program is going to do. We're going to look at these multi-domain cognitive functionings, functional mobility assessments, as well as aspects of real world function, where function perhaps might matter most for individuals with neurologic conditions, right? We're going to look at perspective, fall risk, and physical activity, and look at how they may relate to biological age calculators such as the NHANES Biological Age Index, which provides a multi-bodily system biological age outcome, as well as using incorporating machine learning approaches to measure aspects such as our accelerated brain aging. And again, my last slide, I just want to highlight again why I think this is important, or why it's a good avenue to go down. So in this graph right here, we can see we have our functional status. Again, you can input whether that's cognitive functioning, motor function, general functioning on our y-axis, with lower values representing decreased function. And on our x-axis, we're going to have our chronological age. Our neurotypical or healthy functioning older adults across the lifespan are going to be in our yellow curve, and then our clinical or neurologic populations will be in this green curve. And what we can see again throughout the typical lifespan is we will see that function will tend to deteriorate or start to decline in mid-age and then steadily onwards, decades onwards after midlife. But we've just shown that there's accelerated aging in clinical populations such as multiple sclerosis and Alzheimer's disease. So there's a potential that this decline would begin earlier. And this gap right here represents this biological age. And we think that this biological age represents these accelerated aging trajectories in individuals with neurologic conditions. So if we can decipher at what point of the lifespan or where, or basically this divergence between these curves, if we can pinpoint when that occurs, that gives us the greatest opportunity to go in and to intervene, so that we can have precision medicine approaches, have effective and efficient rehabilitation or interventions, so that we can promote performance, promote functional independence, and overall quality of life for these individuals. And we can ultimately increase their health span. So with that, I would like to thank my funding sources, including the MADRC, again, for their willingness to support some of these ongoing projects, as well as the other funding sources. To thank the Neuroimaging Rehabilitation Lab here at Wayne State for helping with all the studies, the Institute of Gerontology at Wayne State, as well as the Institute of Gerontology's postdoc group, which has been tremendously helpful throughout these processes. And then again, my rec mentees, my rec mentorship committee, Dr. Vega, Dr. Doherty, and Dr. Fritz, as well as other external collaborators. So with that, I will open it up to any questions, and thank you for your attention and listening and the opportunity to present this morning.
Great. Thank you very much, Patty. We do have time for a couple questions. Yeah, we'll open things up.
Hi, Patty. Great
Hi, Dr. Vega.
presentation, like always. Really enjoyed these new approaches. And I have a more philosophical question.
Yeah.
When you have all the cognitive assessments, there is education is a variable that you always have to take in consideration. In your study using movement and coordination, and that is actually the cognitive is actually related to cognitive reserve and how that education, all that. Now, in your coordination aspect of movement and all that, do we develop a different type of reserve if someone was an athlete or play a sport, or like you was a competitive runner, or you get to in the future as you age, would you have a different reserve, or is associated to the cognitive reserve as well, that you actually can maintain coordination or can do things faster, but might not be related to your cognition? You know what I'm going. I don't know if I'm explaining myself well.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think that's a great point too. I definitely think it would absolutely be related to especially their function. So one of the things that we do when we do our cognitive assessments is we do normalize outcomes per education level to make sure that we're accounting for any sort of differences in education. But just like we looked at a more motor reserve, right? We looked at this motor reserve from a mobility standpoint. It's absolutely plausible too that the cognitive reserve may be an equally insightful metric that might be more related to function in the real world. We're having the ability to tap into additional recourses when obstacles and demands and challenges are placed upon us. would absolutely make sense and plausible that some aspect of the cognitive reserve would absolutely be really related to coordination, to mobility, and real world function. And it's definitely something I can consider too, based upon the data that we have. We can calculate a reserve outcome, and that would be really, really interesting to look at and to examine. Because I would absolutely agree that it would definitely be related.
So in your sample, do you have individuals that reported to be, any sport competitively or something like that you can check for?
Yeah, that's a great question. We do ask sort of, almost similar to like IPAC questions where we get previous physical activity or activity history. The majority, I'm not sure. We definitely have some variety and variation heterogeneity in, especially in our MS sample, where we may see we've got a nice distribution of ages across the lifespan. So we have, individuals that are as young as 30, and then we have individuals as old as, 75, 80. So we've got a nice distribution of participants across the lifespan, which again might indirectly be related to their physical activity and prior sort of engagement in higher intense activity. But I think it's interesting too that we're seeing that some of these mobility assessments are more tracked to not just general everyday low intensity function, but we're seeing a more significant correlations with, those more vigorous or those higher, those more intense activity minutes in the real world. So again, perhaps these assessments are good at detecting, individuals that are more likely to engage in those more intense and vigorous types of activities. But we can go back and look at our physical activity data for sure and see if we've got any of that information, which might be really helpful.
Looks like Boyko has his hand up. You can go ahead and unmute Boyko.
Oh, thank you. Patrick, very nice talk, a lot of behavioral data. I like very much your backward walking. But I have a question for you. Do you think that there is a place for much more functional neurological or neural approach in addition to the structural brain, sort of imaging brain approach?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I think so too. I think, and we have some of that data available too, which we can certainly explore on and plan on exploring next. And I think so too, corroborating in previous literature too, especially in some of the preclinical studies where they have showed that there's distinct functional networks that may be more active during backwards versus forwards walking, which may give credence to the fact that, it's more sensory and more cognitively demanding task. I think inclusion of more of these functional imaging scans and more would help to kind of further corroborate those previous findings. So absolutely, I think there is a place for it as well. Even things I know, like looking at even on more on the cortex side with the evolution of more mobile EEG and FNIR types of systems, and looking at how these may be, how cortical activation may be different during forward versus backwards walking with, this continued evolution in technologies. It makes these type of analysis much more plausible and exciting to do too.
Can I have one more question?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so when you are talking about different diseases and then sort of overlapping with dementia or Alzheimer's disease, did you consider, do you think that including the Parkinson's patients might give us some new insight in these mobility issues?
Absolutely. I think comparing across populations is always can always be very insightful. And it can help us understand this interaction from, multiple different angles. So again, Parkinson's disease would be a great example where we know the specific, the specific neural underlyings of this pathology. And anything it might be a little bit more not straightforward or simple to include too, but we know that it's fairly strict in terms of how the neuropathology is manifested. What makes it a little bit challenging with MS is that, again, it's so distinct, it is so heterogeneous that, not two individuals are going to with MS are going to come into the lab with the same motor or cognitive profile, because these lesions can pop up anywhere within the nervous system. But I think inclusion things like, Parkinson's disease, where we know we're going to have a lot of motor dysfunction as well, primarily these motor impairments, as well as cognitive profiles as well, But I think it would absolutely help layer on another layer of understanding our interaction. 100%. So if anyone has any Parkinson's data and is willing to help, not a shameless plug.
All right. Well, thank you very much for the talk. That was really great. And we'll see everybody at our next Leaders Initiative talk on July 21st. So have a great rest of your day, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Great job, Patty.
Thank you.